I'm Shivani Gupta. I'm obsessed with small to medium businesses growing. As business owners, we take so much risk and we want to make sure it's worth it. I believe one of the best presents you can give yourself as a business owner is to be able to learn how to scale your people, your profit, and your processes. Welcome to Grow Your Business podcast. I'm Shivani Gupta. I'm your host. And today we're going to talk about complacency. When we look at the old parable of the tortoise and the hare, where they both start off at a particular starting line. And at that starting line, the hare just takes off just as they hear the start and runs and just uses up a lot of energy and takes off. And then once he's over halfway, he stops and goes, wow, the tortoise is really slow. In fact, he's hardly moved from the starting line. And the hare decides in his ego, in his moment where he thinks he's going to win the race anyway and nothing's going to be able to stop him, he gets complacent and he takes a rest. And while he's resting, the tortoise just slowly, very methodically, keeps moving at the fastest pace that he can move, which is not very fast, and eventually wins the race. Now, this happens in terms of complacency when we get a bit ahead in our businesses, whether it's a strategy around our people, whether it's a strategy around our products, whatever the area may be, one of the things we want to do is ensure that our people don't get complacent. So I wanted to share with you some tips in what we can create it and set up a culture in our businesses so that we can avoid being complacent. The first tip is to treat every day as a fresh start. I've spoken about this in other podcasts. I'll speak about this in my coaching sessions. It's called the Shoshin, and Shoshin speaks about having a beginner's mindset. Because when you look at what complacency is about, it's when you get comfort and you think that all of the past accomplishments are going to be the same in the future. As we know how fast the world and our business world particularly is changing, it's important to not be in that comfort zone. And just because you've accomplished things in the past, it is not a sign that we will be able to continue to do that in the future. So treating every day as if it's a new start is really important. Making sure that you look at things, even if you've done them before, even if they haven't worked before, to be able to look at how we create that. The second tip I wanted to speak about is how do we actually take a big goal that we might have and break it down into smaller, succinct, sustainable goals. So many of you would have heard of the SMART principle, and that principle has been around now for many decades. And it talks about making sure that goals are specific, they're measurable, they're achievable or attainable, that they're realistic, and then they have a time frame on them. And when people set SMART goals, the likelihood of them being successful is really great. When it comes to complacency, we can sometimes have these big goals and then we forget to measure them and we forget to use the SMART acronym towards it. However, when we break that big goal into some smaller, sustainable, succinct goals, then it's much easier to be able to apply the SMART principle. And what we want to be able to do is apply that and then make sure that we can measure that and making sure that it's really, really clear in terms of doing that. For those of you listeners that haven't come across the SMART principle, you might want to Google it, but let me just take you very quickly through a sustainable and a very smaller goal that you can break up. So for example, and from a personal perspective, you might have a goal to lose weight. Losing weight is not a SMART goal. So the way that you would break that up into a SMART goal is you might say, I've got a tangible target every day and my specific thing is to eat 1,400 calories per day. How would you measure that? Well, you would measure, for example, your current weight, and you may decide then to measure that daily and keep a little chart and a log of what it is that you are doing. Things that in terms are going to be actionable or attainable, you actually start to say, look, it's not really achievable if I just don't eat and, save that. And I want to also make sure that it's realistic. So for example, currently, if you're eating, let's say 3,000 calories, moving down to 1,400 calories may be too large a jump. So your shorter term goal, if you break that down, might be to get down to 2,500 and then perhaps 2,000 and slowly working on that and getting that down. And the time frame, or the T in the SMART, would be something along the lines of that I will get from weight Y to weight X over a course of 6 months. And again, making sure that that's sustainable. Same thing in our business practices. We want to just be able to apply that to be able to create that. How else do we get our people and our leaders to not be complacent and not become the hare in the tortoise parable? Well, you also want to actually have a look to people that are in your surrounding circles. There is a saying that who you hang around with, you become. And I use that saying with our kids all the time in terms of their friendship groups. And who is it that they admire and look up to, whether that might be from a sporting accomplishment or from an academic accomplishment, or perhaps some extracurricular accomplishments, or just even traits like that they're kind and loving. And they're the people that you want to hang around with. So when it comes to not being complacent, it's also really important that you look at the people around you that drive you, perhaps not too hard, but people that drive you and they want to see you being successful, because then it becomes really important to be able to not be complacent. Whereas when we hang around people that are perhaps complacent, trust me, you will become more and more complacent. The other thing that we want to talk about is the fact that a lot of people talk about, well, I was successful at that and I failed at that. It also comes in really handy to be able to reframe the word failure into a learning experience. So rather than, well, that happened and it was a dismal failure and I lost $50,000 on that particular project. Wow, that was an expensive learning experience. It was an expensive lesson at $50,000, but here are the 3 or 4 key things that I took out. And now I'll be applying that to every project so that I don't actually make the same mistakes over and over again. So it's really important when it comes to complacency that we have a different framework to be able to do that. And the last one, which some people might call a soft skill, some people might call a necessary part, is just being a little bit kinder to yourself. Recently, I was speaking to somebody who is one of my coaches, and I was talking about how I was not able to deliver a particular project that I'd set out, and I was not able to do that in the time frame that I'd set myself. Now, I tend to sometimes put not very realistic timeframes, because I think the time it's going to take me to do is a lot less than it actually does. And if there was nothing else in my life, if I had no partner, no children, if I wasn't socializing, that time frame is absolutely realistic. But with all the other things in life, it was not very realistic. So when I was speaking to my coach about this, he was like, that's really interesting. And what would you say? He asked me this question, what would you say, Shivani, if you were coaching somebody and this is what they had? I'd say, well, look at all the different things that you're trying to juggle, and maybe you had one too many projects. So he just reminded me, which I absolutely needed reminding in that particular session with him, where he said, Shivani, one of the things you want to be able to do is to be a little bit kinder. So for that, it's really important to look at the language that you use, not to other people. For example, you might not, even though you might want to say this to some of your colleagues and perhaps even some of your family members, at times you want to be able to say to them, oh my God, that is the most stupid thing. Or you were not good enough to be able to create that. But how many times do we say that to ourselves in our mindsets? You know, I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not beautiful enough. I'm not. So what are some of the other language that you have? And, you know, you also want to reframe that in terms of I am good enough. I am worthy. Failure is not everything. I've learned my lessons out of that. And how do I actually keep going in terms of moving forward? And like I started this particular podcast around the hare, you don't want to be the hare. And you also don't want to have people in your team that just take off sometimes without really having that bigger picture and the bigger vision in terms of what we're trying to achieve. And you want to be able to make sure that people are not going to be complacent by following some of these guidelines. Any questions that you ever have, please know that my website is called Ask Shivani. Put a note in there, go to the contact page and let me see if I can direct you or be able to support you in your growth. And as always, would just love the fact that if you could take 30 seconds and go to Apple Podcasts and be able to rate and review this podcast. Here's to you and some of your team not being complacent. Thanks for listening. I'm Shivani Gupta, and you've been listening to the Grow Your Business podcast. I hope you got one idea that you can think about or perhaps even implement straight away in your business. Thank you for listening. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn under Ask Shivani. Remember, I call it Ask Shivani, so please send me your questions that I can address in this podcast for you. And I would also so appreciate if you went to the Apple Podcast to rate and review this podcast.